of judicial primacy and to what extent judicial primacy is part of the basic structure. Now, I was very troubled by the fact that yes, judicial primacy has been held to be a part of the basic structure, but the normative justifications as to why that should be the case, number one, weren't entirely clear in the judgment, except for saying that it's a part of judicial independence. And number two was this bit which I'd really like everyone to come in on about the Constituent Assembly debates and the suggestion in the judgment of both Justices Kehar and Lokur that judicial primacy, that is, judges being appointed primarily by a collegium of judges, is consonant with the spirit of Ambedkar, who of course very famously said that the Chief Justice of India should not be given a veto in the appointment of judges. So I think I'd like to kick this off with the first question as to on what normative ground, and maybe Mr. Datta you can start with that. On what normative ground can we think of judicial primacy being a part of the basic structure? And was it right for the judges in the majority, or did they need to rely on the Constituent Assembly debates to try and justify that this was actually the view or not beyond the conceptualization of Ambedkar?
I'll just take the second part of your question. Was it necessary to go into all this? In my opinion, no. Because right from the beginning we said that even if the collegium had provided evidence of being the best possible mechanism to appoint judges, nothing prevented Parliament from putting forth a new mechanism. So what a test was not whether collegium was good or collegium was bad, but whether the 99th Amendment Act was violative of basic structure or not. That was the basic point. But anyway, the Supreme Court has gone elaborately into it. And now coming to your question on primacy of the, I think there is a lot in Justice Kehar's judgment and in Justice Lokur's judgment that even in the Constituent Assembly debates, now if you see the entire debate, they made it very clear that while the Chief Justice should not have the last word, he should not have the veto power, so to speak, there are enough discussions to show that in the balance, the judges must have the last word, the judges must have the last say. Apart from that, you take George Godboy's book or Chandrachud's book, there is empirical evidence that barring one or two stray cases, every time the views of the Chief Justice always prevailed. Right. So there was perhaps a practice and understanding from the beginning that in the matter of appointment of judges, they must have primacy.
I think that's an interesting point where I'd like Mr. Ramachandran to come in. So there is, as Mr. Datta points out, almost a constitutional convention that the appointment will be on the basis of the Chief Justice of India, on the view of the Chief Justice of India.
On the judges' views.
On the judges' views, as in the Chief Justice of India as sort of the pater familias of the judiciary. And this is a point that I think came out in Gautam Bhatia, who's sitting here, his blog, that is a constitutional convention then in this case elevated one to the level of basic structure. So are we thinking of basic structure as something that's evolving over a period of time, in which case is it very basic? That's I guess the first question. And I think the second question related to that is that can a constitutional convention then not be overridden by Parliament, even by Parliament, by in exercise of its constituent power?
Yes, it does elevate a constitutional convention to the status of a pillar in the basic structure, which in my view is impermissible and unwarranted. And surely a constitutional convention can be overridden by a constitution amendment. I mean, I don't think it requires any argument to say so.
Correct. But are we then sticking to the are we then adhering to the view that the basic structure is something that can only be culled out from the original provisions of the Constitution, or can the basic structure then be something that is evolving over a period of time?
It is something which is evolving. One has to concede that. But this is the other point I wanted to make. If you are giving importance to conventions as they have developed, then you are also bound to take note of new threats to the independence of the judiciary which did not exist or were not conceived when the constitution was framed. So when the constitution was framed, we only thought of independence of the judiciary from the political executive, not of these other threats which I have mentioned. So along with those constitution conventions, you ought to have taken note of these new threats to the independence of judiciary and then struck a balance.
Correct. I think that's an interesting point, and I'd like to take that to both Madhav and Mr. Ganguly, which is that if the basic structure is something that can keep evolving, responding to new threats, and I think Mr. Ramchandran validly makes the point that the court can't be selective about what to look at when it reads in something as part of the basic structure. But if it can evolve, then what does that do to another pillar of the basic structure, which is the rule of law? Because then Parliament is at any given point of time not sure of what the basic structure is. Some may say they're still not sure as of this time what the basic structure is, but certainly then the judgment really seems to cement that point of view that the basic structure is evolving. So what does that do to the rule of law?
Before you go to the next speaker, in my anxiety to adhere to your 8 minutes,
Yes.
There was one point I forgot to make about the direction which this basic structure doctrine is going to take. When you were mentioning other aspects of basic structure, the effect of this judgment is going to be that among several pillars, there will be one paramount pillar, that is independence of judiciary as the judges understand it. So other pillars like checks and balances, democratic form of governance, etc., they would not. So the independence of judiciary will be the first pillar among equals.
Correct.
There are two aspects I want to react to your questions. First is regarding the Constitutional Convention. Now, first is regarding the Constitutional Convention. Let's assume that there is a Constitutional Convention, and as Raju said, it's an evolving concept, and Constitution is a dynamic instrument. It can't be put in any formula. You can't put a stop. So it must evolve over a period of time, depending upon the contingencies of the circumstances and the evolution of the society. So therefore, it must evolve, no doubt. But the Constitutional Convention is an argument taken as an argument of convenience to justify two things: supremacy of the judiciary and the collegium. Now that is not what is permissible at all. The reason is twofold. If the argument is that, well, there are what is called memorandums written by the government of India itself post the judge's decision, and they have formulated how this should be worked out, and if the executive government has failed to perform its duties, even in terms of its own understanding about the scope of the judgment, and has failed to follow its own guidelines framed in the form of the memorandum, they are equally blameworthy. So therefore it is open to the parliament, to the civil society, to intervene and see whether it has worked properly or not. And it is an important question as to whether your collegium has functioned properly or not, because independence of judiciary is not independence from executive and legislature, also from judiciary themselves. The judges must feel independent. Now I just give you one example. After the formation of this collegium system, every single judge of a high court crossing through this territory, this part of the territory, must pay their homage to the members of the collegium. And one judge once was told, he was going on some holiday trip with his family. He thought he should call on one of the collegium judges, because they all get their itinerary. He said you can't avoid their knowledge of or having traveled to the place. So he called on to pay his respect, and he was told through the secretary of the judge, who is part of the collegium, today I am busy, let him come tomorrow. So all his program is destroyed. And how do you treat the constitutional authorities like high court judges? Do they have respect for themselves? Can they run a constitutional court? If this is how the collegium has to function, it's very nice to say that I support it. It has functioned very nicely. Has it? Where was the occasion for the parliament to come up with this? You are right, Arvind. There are any amount of defects, but there are solutions to that also. The court could always find a solution, redraft it, or we read down these provisions. There are so many mechanisms, you know it very well. Court could have resorted to all this by retaining the basic concept. Even the question of what you call the quorum. It's very important to provide for the quorum. Now, in the absence of a provision, you can always read the rules of minutes of the meeting. You know how it is to be done. If there is a quorum, then in that quorum, if it has to be odd members. Otherwise, the presiding officer will have a veto, right to veto. There are so many ways to solve the problem.
Mr. Datta, would you want to respond to that?
Just a bit. One is, I'll start with what Mr. Ganguly said about these people paying homage and so on. Well, it is an unfortunate thing, but having said that, in the course of arguments, when the thing went on, when the government was giving examples of egregious cases of judicial impropriety, and I mentioned that nobody has done an empirical analysis that the collegium has appointed, say, 250 judges. How many of them turned out to be bad appointments? Take a comparative study of the judges appointed before the collegium. How many turned out to be good? So we just take anecdotal evidence and say this man, that lady was bad, therefore the collegium is bad, which is not proper. Now, this part of homage part is unfortunate, but I am saying that does not take away and the thing is, why was collegium started? We easily forget the transfer policy. 16 judges being transferred in emergency. You know the havoc that was created before the thing. So that is also a solution. And as you rightly put it, the government can always redraft the law. Mr. Nariman repeatedly told the court, bring out a commission which complies with the parameters laid down by Venkatachalaya committee. We have no objection at all. So nobody supported the collegium. We said you always have a new method. Just make sure that there is independence from any kind of interference.
The Venkatachalaya committee is the same committee minus one.
Exactly. That's all. And to answer your point, why should the judge read down all? You draft a bad law, and then you want the court to come to your rescue. And I'll tell you, this bad drafting was not accidental. In my opinion, it was deliberate. Yes, very deliberate. So, and on last one on basic features. Now, you see, Victor Hugo said you to define your terms. Are we calling it basic structure, basic feature, essential features? What is exactly it? If you ask me frankly, the first discussion you'll find in the Supreme Court is Mudholkar's dissenting judgment in 65 Supreme Court, Sajjan Singh. Please read it. Read Hidayatullah's dissent. Those of you law students, read Hidayatullah's dissent and read Mudholkar's dissent. Hidayatullah says he gets worried. You see, up to 65, 17 amendments had taken place. And then amendments are going too far. So they said that, look, it's time to question, is Parliament really supreme? Are the fundamental rights playthings of the majority? And there, ironically, Mudholkar refers to the essential features, he calls it basic features. And you know where he gets it from? From Chief Justice Cordilis of Pakistan. Ironically. So, that's how the whole debate starts and then goes on to Golaknath and Kesan Bharati. So, if you ask me frankly, there's nothing really in the label, basic structure or basic feature. I would say that there are certain essential features without which our constitution will not be worth it, whether it's religious freedom or secularism or independent judiciary. I would say an aggregate of all the essential features constitutes what is called a basic structure. And each strand is important. And I would totally disagree with my friend Raju Ramchandran, who says that the judges, this fourth judge's case has put the independence as a primary pillar. I don't think there is any kind of hierarchy of essential features. I don't think any paragraph of 1030 pages says anywhere that independent judiciary is the most important basic feature. I don't think it says it.
Correct.
No, it doesn't say so. It doesn't say so. But just as independence primacy has been spelt out from various provisions of the Constitution, so similarly, the fact that the independence of judiciary is the most important pillar is something which I have spelt out from the judgment.
And I think since we are sharing personal insights, Mr. Datar, I think I agree with you entirely that there is no empirical work done as far as pre-collegium and post-collegium, and I must admit that this is what my rather foolish attempt at a DPhil proposal in Oxford started out being. And there was about 1 year of trying with both the collegium and the law ministry to try and get some files, to try and see what's happening as far as judges, why they are getting appointed. I got some response from the law ministry, but I must say that I got no response whatsoever from the collegium. So I had to quickly ditch that plan and start something, as we all lawyers do, a doctrinal analysis of judicial independence and accountability. But Madhav, just coming to you, I think there was an interesting point that was made in terms of reform. That we all know that, and I think there's a theoretical point and a practical point. The theoretical point is that should we consider judicial independence also as including independence of the judges from other judges? As in, is that something that needs to be seriously considered? Because ultimately this question of homage to the collegium is a point that independence is not only from external threats but also from internal threats. That's point number one. And point number two, in terms of a reform proposal, since we are looking forward as well, what do you think about a proposal which was made in 2010 but not passed, to increase the age of retirement of High Court judges from 62 to 65? Given the fact that one of the reasons as to why I am guessing judges are paying homage is because it gives them 3 extra years of service.
Just before that, Olga, I did want to say one thing in response to the historical argument that was made,
please.
right? And I think that the judgment is interesting for its use of history. But I actually think that the use of history in the judgment is simply a response to the state's argument. So the state makes 2 kinds of historical claims. One historical claim that the state makes is, look, the collegium system is a betrayal of historical intent, because this is not what Ambedkar or anybody else intended. And the code is very clever, because what the code does is, look, you can answer that question at any level of abstraction. So rather than asking not what did Ambedkar envisage as the process for appointing judges, why don't we ask what constitutional principle was most sacred to Ambedkar? And if that is the historical question, then the answer is judicial independence, and then you get a completely different answer. And I think in a way, the other response, of course, that the court could have said is, look, that history is entirely irrelevant. But I think that the court's use of that history is actually in response to the state's argument. And you can see both sides playing with that historical material very differently. There's this famous Ronald Dworkin line that there's no such thing as the intentions of the founders waiting to be discovered, it's only waiting to be invented. And both sides are kind of doing a bit of that. The second kind of historical argument is again made by the state, which is that, look, they were good judges prior to 1993, right? And again, so before the collegium you had good judges, and so you don't need the collegium to have a judiciary that's staffed with men and women of high caliber. And again, the court could have potentially said many things, right? But instead, again, the court takes that historical argument by the state and turns it into its head and says, of course you had good judges prior to 1993, because prior to that, de facto, the judges' view on appointments prevailed. And that was a constitutional convention. We codified the convention because of everything that happened during the emergency and so on. And so you're right. If you're telling us that there were good judges prior to the collegium, that's exactly because it's judges who were de facto appointing. And actually, Justice Lokar goes so far as to suggest that judicial primacy in appointments has existed in India since the Government of India Act of 1935. And so I think both of those historical arguments are actually in specific response to the state's claims. So that's something that I just sort of, I don't think that's the bulk of the court's reasoning. I think that would be a mistake. I think it's certainly right that independence has many components, right? And you often wonder that, don't judges also need independence from themselves? And you see this across the professions, right? You see this in medicine, you see this in charter. I mean, the capacity of professions to self-regulate is increasingly under threat. You see it in the Bar Council. You don't need judges. You can just look at lawyers. I mean, But the interesting question, I think, isn't that, because everybody would concede that judges need independence from themselves. It's that what threats of dependence do you think are the gravest? Right? And the collegium system emerged out of an era where you thought that the threat from external bodies was greater than the threat from internal ones, right? And maybe that's broken down today. But I think, and maybe you need some kind of wire media. But I think ultimately it all of those rest on a judgment call on what you think the most serious threat of dependency is. I don't have a view, I must confess, on retirement judges, but on the retirement age. But I can say this as a matter of law. I don't think it's unconstitutional to extend that. So that might be a bit of a plan.
I don't know. That's actually a big claim, because I think anything to do with the judiciary might plausibly be violative of judicial independence in some shape or form after this judgment. But I think that there are 2 aspects, and I think everyone, feel free to come in, and I'm reasonably sure this won't turn into a 9 o'clock news show. So I think I don't want to go one by one anymore. So feel free to come in. But I think there are two aspects that I think we haven't touched on before we go to the floor. And I think one is this point that Mr. Ramchandran makes about balancing different aspects of the basic structure. Because as sort of constitutional judges, one of the key functions that judges have is balancing rights, as in and balancing different aspects. That's sort of very fundamental to judicial functioning. And one of the aspects which seem to, at least on a prima facie reading of it, seems to be missing is the fact that there could be an amendment which has a certain effect on one part of the basic structure but may bolster another part of the basic structure. And I think as someone who assisted the union in the arguments, that was part of the arguments that we were trying to make, that yes, while in a certain type of exclusivist definition of primacy may be missing, but it's actually furthering checks and balances, and you have to see it holistically rather than see one plank of it. So how can we, and I'm not interested in whether the judgment does it rightly or wrongly, yes, and that's a different point and we've discussed it. But in the future, as in given that there may be many claims of this nature which will come, because unlike Indira Gandhi's amendment, which was clearly just affecting judicial review or stopping judicial review, there could be amendments which sort of bolster one part of basic structure, while at the same time having a not necessarily salutary effect on the other. Are we going to say that because it's bad as far as one part is concerned, it's necessarily bad, or how are we going to think about balancing? And the second aspect, and before I throw it open to everybody, is one that we haven't discussed, which is the role of the law minister. The role of the law minister, for those of you who weren't there at the hearings, as it was one of the most entertaining bits of the hearings, especially with Mr. Jethmalani, who, having been a law minister himself, claimed that the law minister should have no part to play in this, because the law minister, being one member, could influence the eminent persons and could affect the independence of the judiciary. So are we saying that are we as a result of this judgment then accepting the position that any role for the executive, because this is any role, because it was 1 out of 6, any role for the executive in the appointments process in a commission-like model, as it is necessarily violative of the independence of the judiciary, because that would have sort of seemingly dangerous effects on how we are seeing the constitutional scheme, because the constitutional scheme is replete with executive having a role as far as rules of the court is concerned, parliament most certainly having a role as far as impeachment is concerned, judicial standards is concerned. So how are we seeing the role of the executive going forward, and how are we seeing balancing different aspects of the basic structure?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a fair question, because a lot of the judgment, I mean, the court says that, look, our concerns with the law minister are conflict of interest. Then there are moments where the court says that there can be principles of parliament, cabinet responsibility, so on and so forth. But I actually don't think that the judgment precludes any role for the executive for two reasons. Number one, the judgment concedes that the executive already has a role. A big part of the judgment is in fact that. The judgment says that, look, under the 1999 memoranda, the executive is already playing a role. So it would be strange to say that the judgment is now holding that the executive can play no role. I think the judgment, the way I read it, is to say that, look, you can't have the executive in a body where the composition is such that it leaves it very open to it influencing the outcome. And it seems to have a judgment call that because of the existing composition, 6 members, the judiciary don't have a casting vote, the executive can basically influence the eminent members.
Yeah, and I guess the follow-up there would be, sorry to interrupt Madhav, but would a possibility of abuse, are we conceding then that the possibility of abuse can be violative of the basic structure?
Well, I think that the
So you're right, as in there is a possibility of abuse.
I mean, well, I think the answer is you'll have possibility of abuses either way, right?
That's right.
But and you can't have any empirical assessment on that. But I think that the solution, I think the answer would be that if you don't have enough checks and balances in the institutional structure. I think you need an institutional structure with more checks and balances. Okay.
See, there is no denial of the fact that the law minister has hitherto played a very important role. This is irrespective of what is the constitution today of, with the agency. And no one can deny that the law ministers at times have actually helped, judiciary coming to a right decision many times. But you have a case like what we had, like what Mr. Nariman pointed out, and we all know it, Dinakaran's case, for example, where the judiciary simply doesn't want to buzz in. They don't want to hear you. The members of the bar, the Madras bar were very keen to convey.
I was there, they refused to meet.
I know, that's what you are a victim of that situation, I should say.
And Karnataka lawyers.
And Karnataka lawyers, both of them are denied. Now, what kind of role then you expect this, collegium to play? in the larger interest of the democracy and also the independence of the judiciary themselves. So they are counterproductive. Their own actions are contrary to the independence of judiciary. And if it fortuitously had not happened the way it happened, Dinakaran would have been a Supreme Court judge, honorable.
Would have been a collegium judge today.
Yes,
As we speak. As we speak.
So that shows the kind of an absurdity.
You know, I'm a little intrigued by the generosity shown by the court in saying that the executive's role is already there. It's one of participative collaboration or collaborative participation. I don't know what the exact expression was. Now, after the second judge's case, the role of the executive is really that of a security clearance agency. You know, when you apply for a job in a large corporation, you are interviewed by HR, and then HR tells you that yes, you got the job, but it's going to take some time to get security clearance, and then they'll check whether your name is there in the police records and things like that. If that role of the security agency is what the court calls participative collaboration, then I'm afraid that's one part. Can I just switch to something else? Can I just switch to something else? Because there are two observations, two gratuitous observations in two different judgments, which, though not necessary, and they are gratuitous, that's there, still reveal a certain mindset, and one can't escape the feeling that it is that mindset which has colored the judgment. Now you take the court's comment on the role of civil society, Justice Kehar's observation. At the present juncture, it seems difficult to repose faith and confidence in civil society to play any effective role in that direction, for the simple reason it is not yet sufficiently motivated nor adequately determined to be in a position to act as a directional deterrent for the political executive establishment. If this is the view of the court on civil society,
Next line is also quite revealing. Hence, we must.
it is therefore that the higher judiciary, which is the savior of the fundamental rights of the citizens of this country by virtue of the constitutional responsibility assigned to it under Article 32 and 226, which must continue to act as the protector of civil society. Now this is one. Now Justice Lokur, in his judgment,
No, just one second, Raju. With the comment, I mean, what reminds me of the good old concept of the British telling Indians that you are still not matured enough to run your bloody country. Why should you ask for independence? Something like that.
no, and let me just also then respond to what Arvind said before I come to my next point. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan is of course an agricultural scientist, an eminent agricultural scientist, but he has occupied an important position in the public life of the country. And if people like either M.S. Swaminathan or Gopal Gandhi or T.S.R. Subramaniam, I'm just giving you three names, three eminent names which are part of public discourse. If such names, we don't have to therefore think of Lata Mangeshkar or Sunil Gavaskar. But surely when we talk of civil society and when a collegium of Chief Justice, leader of the opposition and Chief Justice of India are going to choose eminent persons, it can only be persons of this kind, not the other kind of persons. These are the people who ought to supply the outside element. It can't be persons only connected with law, which means we will be giving births to two more retired Chief Justices. That is not the idea. That is not the idea. Secondly, the other observation which disturbs me is Justice Lokur's observation about the present political executive being most unlikely to agree to a gay candidate. Now, I don't think Justice Lokar thought through this observation before putting it on paper. 377 has been declared to be constitutional and part of the land by the judiciary. You are responsible for making homosexuality a criminal offense. Therefore, if the executive objects to a judge with criminal propensities, is the executive doing its duty or is the executive being conservative? Now, I'm just highlighting this to show that it is this kind of mindset which has colored the entire judicial thinking in this matter when it seeks to exclude others. Yes, of course you can be there as long as we have an overwhelming majority, etc. It is this mindset.
Okay. So Mr. Datta, on the law minister and the
you see, I think the end is, all of us agree, end is to select the best possible judges. We're only discussing the means, either we go the collegium route or we go the particular route. I think if you have a Judicial Appointments Commission, I think the law minister should not be there at all. I've got nothing against the law minister, but if you're talking in terms of a selection process, it's better that he is not there. One thing baffles me, when you select the CAG or when you select the chairman of the UPS, you select the chief of staff of the army, there is no civil society eminent person. How come suddenly you want to select judges? The civil society wants to step in and select. I don't understand. What is the great thing that only when it comes to judges, all these people must have a say?
They are selected by government.
I'm just giving an example. So now, just to tell you about the selection of government, the Union of India said that the general practice is to appoint a Judicial Appointments Commission, and we gave a complete chart of 192 constitutions of the world. Why 192? Because there are 192 United Nations members, and we showed that this is not correct. There are completely diverse ways of appointing. Somewhere the king appoints, the legislature appoints, there's a commission which appoints, then approved by the legislature. There are so many permutations and combinations. Answer your question, I think law ministers should not be there. They can be a representative executive. I'll also tell you one thing. I come from Chennai, where we have not had the best of things going in the judiciary. And let me tell you, whatever Justice Katju may be tweeting and writing about today, but for him, the Madras High Court would have sunk. 17 vacancies were there. Out of 40 judges, 17 vacancies were there. And it was the law minister and the chief minister who was insisting on packing it with men or their thing. And Katju, to his credit, stood firm. For 11 months, the appointment did not go through. Then we filed a PIL at the Supreme Court, and thanks to Mr. Venugopal and Mr. Hari Salve, the appointments came through. So we've always had a huge thing. You see, I find the ministry takes it as kind of a spoiled system. Once I'm in power, my people should be there and so on. So that's been a very bad track record. And as far as eminent person talking is concerned, I did not make Lata Mangeshkar in a light-hearted manner. What I said was, frankly, if you ask me, I think the sitting judges should not be in the commission. It's a very serious job. You can't have at 4:30 have a cup of tea. Oh, Ramcharan is good, appoint him. Datar is bad, reject him. That kind of situation should not be there.
To be the other way.
So, I think it requires a lot more thought process, and I would prefer a commission of retired judges and not law ministers, somebody from the executive side, someone who can really think through it. It's a far, far important job. And I'm quite surprised, because we say that hearsay evidence is bad, but from what I hear, whether collegium or otherwise, most appointments are entirely based on hearsay evidence. That's the unfortunate part.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads us to the conclusion that a system can only be as good as the people who run the system somehow. And so we can think of ways and means and checks and balances, but at the end of the day, as in if the person who's manning the system, be it the executive, be it the judges, as whoever they are, if the interest of the system is not their primary interest, then perhaps as a judiciary, there doesn't seem to be too much of a hope.
The Firm, India's only show on corporate law, tax and audit matters.